Hello, friend, and welcome back to Science for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to rest together inside a topic that many people quietly struggle with, yet rarely speak about in gentle terms. Tonight, we're going to talk about being alone, not as something broken, and not as something to escape, but as something far more nuanced, and in many cases, far more supportive than it's often believed to be. For a long time, being alone has carried a heavy meaning. It's often associated with absence, with lack, or with the feeling that something is missing. Modern life tends to frame constant connection as the default, and anything outside of that as a problem to solve. But science offers a calmer perspective, one that suggests being alone is not automatically distressing, and in many situations can actually be stabilizing, restorative, and deeply human. From a biological point of view, being alone is simply a state of reduced social input, fewer voices to process, fewer expressions to interpret, fewer expectations to manage. This change does not signal danger to the body or the mind. In fact, for many systems, it signals relief. It allows activity to slow, attention to soften, and regulation to rebalance without pressure. This video is not here to convince you that being alone is always pleasant, or that it should be sought out. Instead, it's here to gently explore the quieter truth that being alone is not inherently negative. It is a condition the human nervous system understands well, one it has adapted to over thousands of years, one that can offer rest when the world feels loud, and steadiness when everything else feels demanding. Throughout tonight, we'll move slowly through quiet, science-backed facts about being alone. We'll look at how the brain responds when social demands fall away, how the body interprets quiet environments, and why time without interaction can help the system settle rather than spiral. Nothing here needs to be analyzed or remembered. The ideas are meant to drift, not demand attention. If you enjoy these calm journeys through science, you're welcome to subscribe. And if you feel comfortable, you can leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. It helps others find their way to this quiet space, one listener at a time. For now, there's nothing you need to do. Being alone in this moment does not mean being unsupported. Your body is still regulating. Your brain is still coordinating. Everything that needs to continue is already continuing. As the night goes on, we'll gently explore why being alone can feel softer than expected, and how this quiet state can support rest in ways that are easy to overlook. One of the most important distinctions science makes is between being alone and feeling lonely. These two states are often treated as interchangeable, but biologically and psychologically, they are very different. Being alone describes a physical condition, fewer people present, fewer interactions occurring. Loneliness, on the other hand, reflects an unmet need for connection. It is not caused by the absence of others, but by the absence of meaningful support. This difference matters because the body and mind respond to these states in entirely different ways. Loneliness is associated with heightened vigilance, increased stress signaling, and a sense of uncertainty. Being alone, when it is not paired with distress, does not trigger these same responses. In many cases, the nervous system interprets quiet social environments as neutral or even calming, especially when there is no immediate threat or demand. Studies in neuroscience and psychology show that social interaction requires constant processing. The brain tracks tone, facial expression, timing, and expectation. It predicts responses, adjusts behavior, and monitors itself continuously. When this stream of input pauses, the brain does not panic. Instead, it often reduces its workload. Fewer predictions are needed. Fewer adjustments are required. This shift can allow internal systems to settle into a steadier rhythm. Importantly, feeling comfort while being alone does not mean a person lacks social needs. Humans are social by nature, but that social nature includes cycles. Connection and quiet have always alternated. Time with others and time without others both serve a purpose. The system is designed for fluctuation, not constant engagement. When loneliness is present, the experience of being alone can feel heavy. But when loneliness is absent, being alone can feel spacious. The difference is not the environment itself, but how the brain interprets it. Safety, predictability, and low demand a signal that nothing needs to be fixed or addressed right now. That signal allows tension to ease. This is why some people notice that their breathing slows, their shoulders drop, or their thoughts soften when they finally have time to themselves. The body recognizes that it is no longer required to perform, respond, or anticipate. Being alone becomes a state of reduced pressure rather than reduced worth. Understanding this distinction helps remove unnecessary self-judgment. Feeling comfort while being alone is not avoidance. It is regulation. It is the nervous system responding appropriately to a quieter environment. As this idea settles, attention can gently move toward what happens inside the body when social demands fade. The next step in this exploration lies in how the nervous system responds to being alone, and why this response often supports calm rather than discomfort as the night continues. When social demands fall away, the nervous system begins to shift almost immediately. This shift is not dramatic or sudden. It is subtle, gradual, and often unnoticed. The body does not register being alone as a problem that needs solving. Instead, it recognizes a reduction in incoming signals and adjusts its level of alertness accordingly. Social interaction requires constant readiness. Voices must be interpreted, expressions must be read, timing and tone must be monitored. Even pleasant interactions carry a baseline level of physiological engagement. When these inputs pause, the nervous system no longer needs to stay on standby. Heart rate may slow slightly, muscle tension can ease. Breathing often becomes deeper without intention. This response is linked to the balance between activation and rest within the nervous system. In quieter environments, signals associated with safety and predictability become more prominent. The body does not need to scan for cues or prepare responses. Instead, it can prioritize maintenance, digestion, and internal regulation. These processes are always running, but they function more efficiently when external demand is low. Importantly, this shift does not depend on conscious reassurance. You do not need to tell yourself, that it is okay to be alone for the body to respond. The nervous system reacts to conditions, not beliefs. Reduced noise, fewer interactions, and lower expectations naturally signal that vigilance can soften. For many people, this is why being alone can feel physically relieving before it feels emotionally meaningful. The body often responds first. The sense of calm arrives quietly, sometimes before it is recognized as comfort. This response reflects an ancient pattern. Humans have always alternated between periods of social engagement and periods of quiet, and the nervous system is built to handle both. Being alone also reduces the need for self-monitoring. Without others present, there is less pressure to adjust posture, expression, or behavior. This reduction in self-observation lowers cognitive load and further supports relaxation. The body no longer needs to maintain a presentation. It can simply exist. This does not mean the nervous system shuts down. It remains attentive to the environment, but its focus shifts inward, prioritizing balance over readiness. This inward turn is not withdrawal. It is recalibration. As this understanding settles, attention can move gently toward how the brain responds alongside the body. The next step in this exploration lies in examining how reduced social input allows the brain to redistribute energy and quiet its constant predictive work, supporting rest as the night continues. When a person is alone, emotional regulation often becomes quieter and more efficient. This does not mean emotions disappear or become suppressed. Instead, they tend to lose urgency. Without social feedback to respond to, emotions no longer need to signal outwardly. They are free to move through the system without being shaped for expression or explanation. In social settings, emotions are constantly moderated. The brain tracks how feelings should be displayed, softened, hidden, or adjusted based on context. Even subtle interaction requires emotional calibration. When that calibration is no longer necessary, the emotional system can relax. Feelings are allowed to exist without needing to perform a function. Scientific research shows that emotional intensity is closely tied to interpretation and response. When fewer interpretations are required, emotional peaks often smooth out naturally. This smoothing does not come from control or effort. It emerges from reduced demand. The nervous system no longer needs to amplify signals to ensure they are noticed or addressed. Being alone also reduces emotional comparison. Without external reference points, the brain is less likely to evaluate whether a feeling is appropriate, excessive, or insufficient. This absence of comparison allows emotions to settle into more neutral states. The system does not need to justify what it is experiencing. It simply allows signals to complete their course. This is why many people notice that emotions feel more manageable when they are alone, especially after socially demanding days. The body recognizes that nothing needs to be communicated or defended. Emotional signals can resolve without being interrupted by feedback, expectation, or response. Importantly, emotional regulation in quiet conditions does not require reflection, insight, or problem solving. The brain does not need to understand what it is feeling in order to regulate it. Regulation unfolds through reduced stimulation, consistent timing, and the absence of external pressure. The system returns toward balance on its own. For some, emotions may briefly feel clearer when alone, simply because the surrounding noise has faded. This clarity does not mean emotions are growing stronger. It means they are no longer being blended with external signals. As the system adjusts, intensity often softens rather than increases. From the perspective of the mind, this process can feel like emotional space opening rather than closing. Feelings are present, but they no longer press for interpretation or action. They are allowed to exist and then pass without needing to be named, shared, or resolved. Understanding this helps reframe being alone as emotionally supportive rather than risky. In the absence of social demand, the emotional system is not left unattended. It is given the conditions it needs to settle naturally, allowing the night to continue without emotional strain or expectation. When a person is alone, something subtle begins to change in the background of awareness. It is not dramatic, and it is not always noticed right away. The change does not come from adding anything new, but from the absence of something familiar. Without an audience, the continuous process of self-monitoring begins to loosen its grip. There is no longer a need to evaluate posture, expression, timing, or tone. The system no longer needs to maintain alignment with another person's expectations. In social environments, even calm ones, the brain carries a quiet responsibility. It tracks how actions might be perceived, how words might land, and how behavior should be adjusted moment by moment. This happens automatically, without conscious effort. It is part of how humans stay connected and cooperative. But it also requires energy. When a person is alone, this responsibility is no longer necessary. The brain recognizes that nothing needs to be presented or maintained. As this recognition settles, mental activity begins to change shape. Thoughts often become less linear and less rehearsed. Internal dialogue may slow, soften, or fragment gently. This does not signal confusion or disengagement. It reflects a shift away from optimization. The mind no longer needs to organize itself for clarity or coherence. It can afford to be less structured. Without an audience, the brain also releases its grip on narrative. There is no need to explain what is happening internally or to prepare language for sharing later. Experiences do not need to be packaged. They can exist briefly and then dissolve. This reduces cognitive load in a way that feels subtle but meaningful. The system is no longer maintaining a storyline. It is simply continuing. This softening often extends into the body as well. Muscle tension can decrease. Breathing may deepen without intention. The absence of observation removes a layer of readiness that the nervous system usually maintains. There is no one to respond to and nothing to anticipate. The body receives this as a signal that effort can decrease. Importantly, this shift does not remove awareness. The brain remains responsive to the environment. Sounds are still heard. Sensations are still present, but they are not prioritized for response. They are allowed to pass without being categorized or evaluated. Attention becomes less pointed and more ambient. supporting rest rather than analysis. For many people, this is why being alone can feel mentally spacious. There is room for experience to unfold without pressure. Thoughts do not need to go anywhere. Feelings do not need to resolve. The system is free to remain incomplete. This incompleteness is not a problem. It is a form of efficiency. Over time, the absence of an audience allows the brain to settle into a quieter mode of organization. Activity does not stop, but it becomes less demanding. Networks coordinate without urgency. The system shifts from readiness to maintenance, from response to balance. Nothing needs to be held together. Coordination persists on its own. This process often unfolds more clearly at night, when social roles naturally fall away. Fewer expectations exist. Fewer identities need to be maintained. The brain recognizes this shift in context and responds by releasing effort even further. The sense of needing to be someone for someone else fades gently into the background. Seen this way, being alone is not an empty state. It is a state of reduced obligation. The brain is no longer required to account for external perspectives. It can return to a simpler form of organization, one that prioritizes steadiness over presentation. In that simplicity, the pace of experience slows, and rest becomes possible without invitation, instruction, or intention. When a person is alone, attention begins to behave differently. It does not disappear, and it does not sharpen. Instead, it broadens. Without social interaction to anchor it, attention becomes less goal-oriented and less constrained. The brain no longer needs to direct awareness toward cues that require response. This shift allows attention to loosen its structure and move more freely. In social settings, attention is constantly being guided. It tracks voices, expressions, timing, and relevance. Even passive interaction requires attention to remain partially engaged, ready to respond if needed. This readiness shapes how awareness is distributed. Attention becomes narrow, prioritized, and selective. When a person is alone, that selectivity becomes less necessary. As external demands fall away, attention begins to spread across experience rather than locking onto specific elements. Sounds may be noticed without being identified. Sensations may be felt without being interpreted. Thoughts may arise without being followed. This change does not indicate distraction. It reflects a different mode of organization, one that favors openness over precision. Neuroscience research shows that attention is not a single process, but a coordinated pattern across networks. When attention is tightly focused, certain networks dominate. When focus is no longer required, those networks quiet and others become more active. This shift allows information to circulate more broadly rather than being filtered aggressively. The brain moves from selection to integration. Being alone supports this transition naturally. Without interaction, the brain does not need to decide what matters most in the moment. There is no hierarchy of relevance imposed by conversation or expectation. Attention becomes less evaluative and more ambient. Experience is allowed to exist without ranking. This ambient attention supports rest because it reduces cognitive effort. Selecting, prioritizing, and maintaining focus all require energy. When those processes relax, the brain conserves resources. Activity continues, but it is less costly. The system can sustain itself more comfortably over time. For many listeners, this is why being alone can feel mentally quieter, even when thoughts are still present. The thoughts themselves are not the source of strain. The strain comes from managing them. When attention no longer needs to organize experience tightly, mental activity can occur without friction. This shift also changes how time is experienced. Without focused attention marking moments, time often feels less segmented. Minutes blur together. There is less urgency to track duration. This temporal softening supports sleep readiness by reducing the sense that something must happen next. Importantly, this change in attention does not require intention. You do not need to try to relax your focus for it to happen. The brain responds to conditions. When demands are low and predictability is high, attention reorganizes automatically. The system knows how to rest when given the opportunity. As attention broadens, the need to control it fades. There is nothing to keep track of and nothing to miss. Awareness becomes less effortful, more receptive. This receptive state allows rest to deepen without instruction, as the brain continues to coordinate quietly in the background. Understanding this shift helps explain why being alone can feel mentally spacious rather than empty. Attention is not withdrawn. It is redistributed. Freed from constant direction, it becomes gentle, diffuse, and supportive of rest. In that gentleness, the night has more room to unfold at its own pace, without demand or interruption. Being alone often changes not just what is happening around you, but what is being asked of you. In quieter moments, fewer signals arrive that require interpretation, decision, or response. The brain is still receiving information, but much less of it carries urgency. Nothing is calling for correction. Nothing is requesting engagement. This shift alters how internal activity organizes itself. In everyday environments, the brain operates under a steady stream of requests. Sounds imply meaning. Movements imply intention. Even small changes in the environment can signal that something should be monitored or prepared for. Over time, this creates a layered background of readiness. When a person is alone, many of these requests simply do not arrive. Without signals that require response, the brain reduces its rate of internal checking. It no longer needs to ask whether something matters, whether something is changing, or whether action might soon be required. Activity does not stop, but it becomes less conditional. Patterns unfold without being constantly interrupted by evaluation. This reduction has a noticeable effect on internal pacing. Thoughts are less likely to overlap. Sensations are less likely to trigger interpretation. The brain is not suppressing activity. It is allowing it to proceed without being redirected. This creates a sense of internal smoothness rather than silence. One reason this feels calming is because prediction becomes simpler. In quiet conditions, fewer outcomes need to be simulated. The brain does not need to model social reactions, anticipate feedback, or prepare explanations. The future becomes less demanding to imagine. When prediction slows, Internal pressure often decreases with it. This change also affects how the brain manages error. In social or stimulating environments, the brain is constantly correcting itself, adjusting behavior and interpretation to stay aligned with context. When alone, fewer corrections are necessary. There is no performance to refine. Activity can continue without being revised. Over time, this allows internal systems to synchronize more naturally. Instead of competing for priority, processes begin to align around maintenance and balance. Signals that were previously amplified to ensure readiness can return to baseline. The brain is not being optimized for response. It is being supported in continuity. Importantly, this does not require intentional quieting or mental discipline. The system responds to conditions, not instructions. When fewer signals demand action, the brain reorganizes automatically. Effort fades because it is no longer useful. This is why being alone can feel mentally relieving even if thoughts are still present. The relief does not come from emptiness. It comes from the absence of demand. Thoughts are allowed to exist without needing to justify themselves or lead anywhere. As this state continues, the brain settles into a form of activity that is less fragmented and more rhythmic. Timing becomes smoother. Internal transitions feel less abrupt. The system no longer needs to jump between possibilities. It can remain where it is. Seen this way, quiet time alone does not remove stimulation. It removes obligation. And without obligation, the brain does not need to hold itself tightly together. It can continue in a steadier, more economical way, allowing the night to stretch forward without asking for attention, explanation, or response. When a person is alone, time begins to feel different, not because the clock changes, but because experience is no longer being actively shaped for interaction. Moments are no longer measured by response or reaction. There is no need to decide what should be remembered, shared, or explained. This change creates conditions where experiences can settle rather than accumulate. During socially active periods, the brain continuously tags moments for relevance. It evaluates what might matter later, what might need to be referenced, and what should be adjusted in real time. This tagging process is subtle, but it adds weight to experience. When a person is alone, much of that tagging falls away. Events no longer need to be sorted for usefulness. They can simply pass. This shift affects how memory-related processes unfold. The brain does not store experiences as fixed records. Instead, it integrates them gradually, reshaping patterns based on timing and context. Quiet time alone provides space for this integration to occur without interruption. Experiences that were once sharp soften. Details lose urgency. What remains is a generalized sense of continuity rather than a collection of moments. Importantly, this settling does not require reflection. You do not need to think about what happened earlier in order for integration to occur. The brain does this on its own, revisiting patterns in the background as activity slows. When fewer new inputs arrive, existing patterns have room to reorganize without being displaced. Being alone also reduces the pressure to evaluate experience while it is happening. In social settings, moments are often judged immediately. Was something said correctly? Did a reaction make sense? Should something be remembered? This ongoing evaluation keeps experiences active longer than necessary. Without that evaluation, experiences are allowed to complete their cycle naturally. Over time, this leads to a sense of internal spaciousness. The brain is no longer carrying unfinished interactions or unresolved interpretations. Activity becomes less layered. Instead of stacking moments on top of one another, the system allows them to spread out and settle. This reduces cognitive friction and supports rest. This effect is especially noticeable at night. The absence of social demand combines with the body's natural tendency to slow. The brain recognizes that there is no immediate need to prepare for action. It shifts toward consolidation rather than engagement. The present moment becomes sufficient on its own. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle quieting of mental momentum. Thoughts may still arise, but they do not pull attention forward. There is less sense of needing to follow or resolve them. The system no longer treats experience as something to manage. This settling also influences emotional tone. Feelings that were previously amplified by interpretation begin to smooth out. Without repeated revisiting, emotional signals lose intensity. The brain does not need to dampen them actively. It simply stops feeding them with evaluation. Understanding this process helps explain why time alone often feels restorative, even when nothing noticeable happens. Restoration is not about adding something new. It is about allowing what already exists to return to balance. When experiences are given space to settle, the system becomes lighter without effort. As this quiet integration continues, the brain prepares for deeper rest. There is less to carry forward and less to hold in place. Activity becomes simpler, guided more by rhythm than by memory. The night can continue without interruption, allowing rest to deepen as time moves forward gently, without demand or direction. When a person is alone, one of the quietest yet most meaningful shifts that occurs is a reduction in readiness. In everyday life, the brain maintains a low-level state of preparation. It stays slightly ahead of the present moment, anticipating questions, reactions, interruptions, or changes. This readiness is not stressful by default, but it does require constant background effort. Being alone removes many of the reasons this effort exists. In social environments, readiness takes many forms. The brain monitors for cues that signal a need to respond. It tracks changes in tone, posture, or movement that might require adjustment. Even silence in the presence of others can carry expectation. The system remains alert, not because danger is present, but because engagement is possible. When a person is alone, that possibility fades. As readiness becomes unnecessary, the brain begins to stand down from its anticipatory posture. This does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually as the environment continues to offer no demands. The longer nothing asks for response, the more confident the system becomes that it can relax its guard. Activity shifts from preparation to maintenance. This change has a noticeable effect on internal pacing. Without the need to be ready, thoughts slow their forward momentum. There is less mental leaning into the next moment. The brain does not need to simulate upcoming interactions or rehearse potential responses. Instead, it can remain where it is, allowing activity to circulate without urgency. Reduced readiness also affects the body. Muscles that were subtly engaged in posture or expression begin to release. Breathing becomes less controlled and more automatic. The body receives the signal that it does not need to present itself or react quickly. This signal supports relaxation without requiring conscious permission. Importantly, this shift does not compromise awareness. The brain remains capable of responding if needed. Sounds are still registered. Changes in the environment are still noticed. What changes is priority. The system no longer treats every signal as potentially relevant. It allows most information to pass without being elevated. Over time, this reduced readiness supports a sense of safety. Safety is not only the absence of threat, it is the absence of expectation. When nothing is likely to happen that requires action, the brain interprets the environment as stable. Stability allows internal systems to settle into slower, more economical patterns of coordination. This is one reason being alone can feel especially calming after long periods of interaction. The brain has been holding itself in a prepared state for extended time. Alone, it finally receives confirmation that it can release that posture. The relief comes not from isolation, but from the absence of demand. The effect deepens as time alone continues. The brain does not rush to relax. It waits for consistency. Each quiet moment reinforces the signal that readiness is no longer necessary. Gradually, anticipatory loops lose relevance. Activity becomes less future-oriented and more rhythmic. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle settling. There is less sense of needing to stay alert. Thoughts feel less pointed. Awareness becomes more evenly distributed. The effort of holding oneself ready fades into the background. This does not mean the system becomes inactive. It means it becomes efficient. Energy is conserved. Attention is no longer pulled forward. The brain continues to regulate itself in a way that favors sustainability rather than responsiveness. Understanding this shift helps explain why being alone can feel restorative even without quiet or stillness. Restoration does not require perfect conditions. It requires the removal of expectation. When readiness is no longer needed, the brain naturally returns to a steadier mode of operation. As this state continues, the system becomes increasingly aligned with rest. There is less to anticipate and less to manage. The present moment becomes sufficient. The night stretches forward without asking for preparation, allowing the brain to continue quietly, guided by balance rather than readiness, as rest deepens naturally. When a person is alone, the brain gradually releases its hold on narrative. In everyday social life, the brain is constantly maintaining small stories. Who am I right now? How am I coming across? What has just happened? And what might happen next? These stories are not deliberate or dramatic. They are practical frameworks the brain uses to stay oriented during interaction, but they require effort to sustain. Social environments encourage narrative continuity. Conversations have beginnings, middles, and implied endings. Interactions carry context that must be remembered and updated. Even brief exchanges require the brain to keep track of roles, tone, and shared understanding. This storytelling happens quietly in the background, shaping how experience is organized moment by moment. When a person is alone, many of these narrative demands dissolve. There is no shared context to maintain and no external storyline to keep coherent. The brain no longer needs to position events within a social framework. Experience does not need to be threaded into a sequence that makes sense to someone else. This absence allows internal activity to simplify. As narrative pressure fades, mental activity becomes less structured around cause and effect. Thoughts may arise without needing to connect to one another. Sensations can be felt without being placed into meaning. The brain is no longer required to hold experience together in a communicable way. This does not create confusion. It creates lightness. This reduction in narrative maintenance frees cognitive resources. The brain can shift away from organizing experience into stories and toward maintaining balance across systems. Activity becomes less about interpretation and more about regulation. Signals move without being recruited into explanation. The system no longer needs to ask what something means or where it fits. Importantly, this shift does not remove memory or awareness. The brain still recognizes what is happening. It simply stops weaving those moments into a narrative thread. Experience becomes more immediate and less referential. There is no need to compare the present to the past or prepare it for the future. Each moment can stand on its own. For many people, this is why being alone feels mentally freeing. There is less pressure to make sense of oneself. Identity becomes less active. The brain does not need to reinforce a consistent version of the self for others. Without that task, mental activity can settle into a quieter pattern. This effect deepens over time. The longer a person remains alone, the fewer narrative fragments remain active. Stories that were partially formed lose momentum. The brain does not hold on to them because there is no context requiring their continuation. Activity becomes more fluid, less bound by sequence. At night, this effect is especially supportive of rest. The brain naturally shifts away from narrative organization as sleep approaches. Being alone accelerates this shift by removing the need to maintain coherence for interaction. The system can move more easily toward a state where stories fade and rhythm takes over. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle unraveling. Thoughts appear less tied to identity or purpose. There is no need to follow them. The sense of being a character within a story softens. What remains is presence without plot. Understanding this helps explain why being alone can feel calming even when thoughts are present. It is not the absence of thought that brings ease. It is the absence of narrative obligation. When the brain no longer needs to tell a story, it can rest within experience itself. As this state continues, mental activity becomes increasingly simple, not empty but unburdened. The brain remains active, but it no longer organizes experience into something that must go somewhere. This simplicity supports rest by allowing the night to unfold without direction, sequence, or expectation, carried forward gently by rhythm rather than story. When a person is alone for a sustained period, the brain and body begin to drift back toward a more neutral baseline. This does not mean emotional flatness or absence of experience. It means the system is no longer being pulled strongly in any particular direction. Without social cues to amplify, suppress, or redirect internal states, activity gradually settles into balance. In everyday interaction, the nervous system is constantly nudged away from neutral. Excitement, concern, interest, and alertness are all shaped by context. Even calm conversations subtly influence arousal and emotional tone. These shifts are not harmful, but they do accumulate. Over time, the system can remain slightly elevated or slightly constrained without realizing it. Being alone provides an opportunity for those accumulated adjustments to unwind. This return toward neutral happens slowly. The brain does not snap back to baseline the moment interaction ends. It watches for consistency. Each quiet moment reinforces the signal that no immediate engagement is required. As that signal repeats, internal systems begin to recalibrate. Chemical balances adjust. Timing smooths out. Activity becomes less reactive and more evenly distributed. Neutral does not mean empty. Sensations are still present. Thoughts still arise. What changes is their intensity and urgency. Signals no longer need to compete for attention. Without external reference points, the brain does not need to rank experiences as important or unimportant. They are allowed to exist briefly and then pass without being held in place. This process is especially supportive of rest because sleep depends on neutrality. The brain cannot move toward sleep if it remains oriented toward response. It must first return to a state where nothing is demanding priority. Being alone helps create that state by removing the need for readiness, interpretation, and social alignment. The body responds alongside the brain. Muscle tone softens. Breathing becomes more regular. Subtle physiological rhythms begin to synchronize. These changes do not require conscious relaxation. They emerge naturally when the environment remains predictable and undemanding. The system recognizes that it can afford to settle. For many people, this is why being alone feels more comfortable after some time has passed. The initial contrast of quiet may feel noticeable, but as neutrality returns, the sense of ease grows. The body and brain are no longer carrying residual activation from earlier interactions. They are returning to their own timing. This return to neutral also supports emotional balance. Feelings that were influenced by external feedback lose their amplification. Without reinforcement, emotional signals complete their cycle and fade. The brain does not need to push them away. It simply stops sustaining them. From the perspective of the mind, neutrality can feel like calm without effort. There is no need to reach for distraction or reassurance. Experience feels steady rather than charged. The absence of demand allows awareness to rest where it is, without needing to adjust. Understanding neutrality in this way helps reframe being alone as a regulatory state rather than a deficient one. The system is not lacking input. It is restoring balance. This restoration is not dramatic, but it is essential. It allows the brain to reset its internal tone so that rest becomes possible. As neutrality deepens, the system becomes increasingly aligned with sleep. There is less internal pull and less resistance. Activity continues, but gently, guided by rhythm rather than urgency. The night moves forward without pressure, and the brain follows, settling into its own steady pace as rest approaches naturally. When a person is alone, one of the quieter changes that occurs is a reduction in self-interpretation. In social life, the brain is constantly interpreting not just the environment, but the self within it. It monitors how actions might be understood, how words might be taken, and how internal states should be adjusted to fit the moment. This interpretation happens automatically and continuously, forming a background layer of mental effort. Even when nothing is being said or done, the brain often keeps this interpretive loop active. It checks for alignment. It evaluates whether reactions are appropriate. It subtly shapes behavior to match expectations that may not even be spoken. This ongoing process helps social interaction run smoothly, but it also adds weight to experience. The brain is not only living the moment, it is explaining it. When a person is alone, this explanatory layer begins to lose relevance. There is no external viewpoint to account for, and no shared frame that requires maintenance. The brain no longer needs to translate experience into something legible to others. Sensations, thoughts, and feelings can exist without being contextualized or refined. As this need for interpretation fades, mental activity becomes simpler. Thoughts no longer need to justify themselves. Feelings no longer need to be categorized or labeled. The brain does not have to decide what an experience says about the self. It can allow experience to arise and dissolve without attaching meaning to it. This shift is subtle, but it has a powerful effect on rest. Interpretation requires energy. It involves comparison, evaluation, and prediction. When interpretation is no longer required, cognitive effort decreases naturally. The brain conserves resources by allowing experience to remain unprocessed beyond what is necessary for regulation. This is one reason being alone can feel mentally relieving even when nothing changes externally. The relief does not come from distraction or stimulation. It comes from the absence of translation. Experience no longer needs to be turned into a statement about who you are or what you should do next. Over time, the absence of self-interpretation allows the brain to return to a more neutral mode of awareness. Identity becomes less active. The sense of being observed, even internally, softens. The brain is no longer narrating the self in real time. It is simply maintaining balance. This effect often deepens at night, when expectations naturally fall away. Fewer roles are active. Fewer decisions are pending. The brain recognizes that interpretation is no longer useful. It gradually releases the need to explain experience to itself, allowing awareness to become more open and less structured. Importantly, this does not lead to confusion or loss of self. The brain retains its organization. What changes is emphasis. Interpretation becomes optional rather than automatic. Experience does not need to be sorted or framed in order to pass. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle quieting of internal commentary. Thoughts still appear, but they do not carry the same weight. There is less pressure to decide what they mean. They can arrive, linger briefly, and then move on without leaving a trace. Understanding this process helps explain why being alone can feel grounding rather than isolating. The brain is not withdrawing from experience. It is stepping back from interpretation. In that step back, mental effort decreases, and the system becomes more receptive to rest. As the need to interpret continues to fade, the brain shifts further toward a state that supports sleep. Experience no longer demands explanation. Awareness no longer needs to hold itself together. The night becomes a space where nothing has to be defined, and in that undefined space, rest finds room to arrive on its own, without instruction or expectation. When a person is alone, thoughts often begin to change not in content, but in urgency. They may still appear, sometimes frequently, but they no longer demand immediate attention or resolution. Without social context pressing for clarity or response, thoughts are allowed to exist without needing to be acted on. This shift reduces mental strain in a quiet, cumulative way. In social environments, thoughts are often evaluated quickly. Is this relevant? Should this be said? Does this require a response? The brain treats many thoughts as potential actions. Even idle ideas are briefly assessed for usefulness. This assessment happens automatically, and over time, it creates a sense that thoughts must lead somewhere. Being alone removes much of this pressure. As urgency fades, the relationship to thought changes. Thoughts are no longer treated as instructions or warnings. They become passing signals rather than prompts for action. The brain does not need to prioritize them aggressively. This allows mental activity to slow without needing to stop. Neuroscience suggests that urgency is closely tied to prediction and consequence. When a thought is likely to lead to interaction or decision, it carries weight. When consequences are distant or absent, urgency drops. Being alone reduces immediate consequence. There is no one to answer to and nothing that must be decided right now. The brain recognizes this shift and adjusts accordingly. This adjustment often feels like relief. Thoughts can come and go without being rehearsed or refined. There is no need to resolve them before they disappear. The brain is no longer holding thoughts in place for later use. It allows them to complete their cycle naturally. This does not mean thoughts become meaningless or shallow. It means they are no longer recruited into obligation. A memory may surface without needing interpretation. An idea may appear without needing evaluation. The brain is free to let activity unfold without steering it toward outcome. Over time, this reduces mental friction. When thoughts are not treated as tasks, fewer resources are spent managing them. The system becomes more economical. Energy is conserved not by suppressing thought, but by releasing the need to respond to it. For many people, This is why being alone feels mentally calming, even if the mind remains active. Calm does not require silence. It requires the absence of pressure. When thoughts are no longer urgent, they lose their ability to pull attention forward forcefully. This effect deepens gradually. The longer the absence of demand continues, the more confident the brain becomes that urgency is unnecessary. Thoughts slow their arrival and soften their intensity, not because they are being controlled, but because there is no reason for them to be loud. At night, this process aligns naturally with the body's rhythms. As the environment remains quiet and predictable, the brain continues to lower urgency across systems. Thought becomes less directive and more ambient. Awareness does not need to chase or resolve anything. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like mental breathing space. Thoughts are present, but they are not gripping. There is room between one thought and the next. That space allows rest to form without effort. Understanding this shift reframes active thinking as compatible with relaxation. It is not the presence of thought that disrupts rest. It is the belief that thought must be answered. Being alone gently removes that belief. As urgency continues to fade, the brain moves closer to a state where thinking no longer competes with rest. Activity continues quietly, without insistence. The night becomes a place where thoughts can pass without consequence, allowing the system to settle into a slower, steadier rhythm that supports sleep without resistance or demand. There is a quiet moment that often arrives after being alone for a while, when the body realizes it does not need to hold itself in place anymore. This realization does not come as a thought. It comes as a sensation, a subtle easing, a softening that happens without effort, as if the body has finally been told it can stop waiting. Throughout the day, the body maintains a series of holding patterns. These patterns are not rigid or obvious, but they are persistent. Muscles stay lightly engaged. Posture remains adjusted. Facial expression stays responsive. Even when sitting or lying still, the body is subtly prepared to react, to move, or to express. This preparation is not a sign of stress. It is simply part of being around other people. Social environments ask the body to remain available. The nervous system keeps certain systems partially activated, so response can happen quickly and smoothly. Shoulders remain lifted just enough. The jaw stays slightly engaged. The breath adjusts itself to support speech and attention. These patterns operate quietly, below conscious awareness, but they require energy to sustain. When a person is alone, these demands begin to disappear. There is no longer a reason to stay prepared. No signal suggests that movement or expression will be needed. As this absence continues, the body begins to test the environment. It releases a small amount of tension and waits. When nothing happens, it releases a bit more. This gradual release is important. The body does not drop all effort at once. It looks for consistency. Each quiet moment reinforces the message that readiness is unnecessary. Over time, muscles begin to relax in places that were not consciously tense. The shoulders lower, the neck softens, the hands rest more fully. These changes are not directed, they emerge naturally. Breathing often deepens during this process. Without the need to coordinate breath with conversation or reaction, the body allows its respiratory rhythm to slow. The breath becomes less controlled and more cyclical. This shift sends calming feedback to the nervous system, reinforcing the sense that effort can decrease further. As breathing settles, other systems respond. Heart rhythm becomes more variable. Muscle tone evens out. The body moves away from a state of readiness and toward a state of maintenance. This does not mean the body becomes inactive or unresponsive. It remains capable. What changes is how much energy is being held in reserve. Over time, the absence of social demand allows the body to return to its own natural alignment. Stillness becomes more comfortable. Movement becomes less deliberate. There is no need to hold the body in a way that communicates anything. It does not need to appear attentive, open, or engaged. It can simply exist. This shift is especially noticeable at night. The body recognizes the end of the day not by the clock, but by the absence of expectation. There are no upcoming interactions to prepare for, no roles to maintain. The nervous system responds by continuing to release patterns that were useful earlier, but are no longer needed. From the perspective of the mind, this physical release can feel grounding and reassuring. Awareness sinks gently into sensation. There is less need to monitor the body or adjust it. The sense of effort fades, replaced by a feeling of being supported rather than held together. Understanding this process helps explain why being alone can feel physically comforting even before emotional calm arrives. The body responds first. It does not require reassurance or explanation. It simply notices that nothing is being asked of it and adjusts accordingly. As these holding patterns continue to dissolve, the body enters a state where rest becomes more accessible. There is less tension to unwind and less readiness to stand down from. The distinction between being alert and being at ease begins to blur. In this state, the body no longer feels like something that must be managed. It becomes a place where rest can settle naturally. Being alone provides the conditions for this shift, not by adding comfort, but by removing the need to stay prepared. And as the night continues, the body carries forward quietly, guided by its own rhythms, allowing sleep to approach without effort, expectation, or urgency. As being alone continues, time itself often begins to feel less rigid. This change does not come from clocks slowing down or minutes disappearing, but from the way the brain relates to duration. In social and task-focused environments, time is constantly being measured. Moments are evaluated based on what should happen next, how long something will take, or whether something is being delayed. When a person is alone, many of these measurements quietly lose relevance. In shared spaces, time is shaped by coordination. Conversations follow rhythms. Activities are scheduled. Attention is often pulled forward toward the next response or expectation. Even rest can feel timed, as if it must fit into a limited window. The brain uses time as a tool to stay aligned with others and with plans. This tool requires constant reference and adjustment. When a person is alone, that reference system begins to relax. There is no need to synchronize with another person's pace. No need to mark moments for interaction. The brain no longer has to keep track of how long something has lasted or how soon it must change. Time stops functioning as a framework for action and becomes a background condition instead. This shift affects internal pacing. Thoughts no longer need to arrive on schedule. Sensations are not checked against duration. The brain is free to experience the present without continually linking it to what comes next. This allows attention to linger gently rather than moving forward in steps. Neuroscience shows that the perception of time is closely tied to attention and anticipation. When attention is focused tightly and anticipation is high, time feels structured and segmented. When anticipation fades, time becomes more fluid. Being alone reduces anticipation because fewer outcomes need to be predicted. The future carries less immediate weight. As a result, moments begin to blend together. There is less distinction between 1 minute and the next. This blending is not disorientation. It is a form of cognitive ease. The brain no longer needs to label or separate experience into units. It can allow experience to flow continuously. This loosening of time supports rest because sleep does not operate on measured intervals. Sleep emerges when the brain releases its grip on sequence. Being alone helps create that release by removing the need to track progress or completion. Nothing needs to be finished. Nothing needs to begin. For many people, this is why time alone at night feels different from time alone during the day. The environment already offers fewer cues that demand scheduling or action. The brain recognizes this and allows its internal clock to soften further. The sense of urgency fades alongside the sense of duration. Importantly, this change does not mean the brain loses orientation. It still knows where it is and what is happening. What changes is emphasis. Time no longer needs to guide behavior. It becomes less directive and more ambient, like a slow current rather than a ticking signal. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like drifting without losing awareness. There is no pressure to keep track. Experience does not need to be placed on a timeline. It can simply unfold and dissolve as it does. Understanding this effect helps explain why being alone can make rest feel more accessible. The brain is no longer organizing experience around before and after. Without that structure, it can move more easily towards states that depend on continuity rather than sequence. As the sense of time continues to loosen, the system becomes increasingly aligned with sleep. There is less internal motion pulling awareness forward. The present moment stretches gently, offering space rather than demand. In that space, the night carries on quietly, allowing rest to arrive in its own way without being scheduled, measured, or expected. As being alone continues, the brain gradually releases another subtle habit: the need to anticipate outcomes. In everyday life, anticipation operates quietly in the background. The brain constantly asks what might happen next, how situations could unfold, and what response might be required. This forward-leaning activity is useful during interaction, but it carries a steady cognitive cost. When a person is alone, many of the reasons for anticipation disappear. In social environments, anticipation helps the brain stay coordinated. It prepares replies, predicts reactions, and adjusts behavior before anything actually occurs. Even in calm situations, the brain stays slightly ahead of the present moment, modeling possibilities that may never happen. This process is automatic and rarely noticed, yet it keeps the system subtly activated. When a person is alone, the number of possible outcomes narrows. There are fewer variables to account for and fewer changes to prepare for. The environment becomes predictable, not because it is empty, but because it is stable. With nothing requiring rehearsal or forecasting, the brain begins to relax its forward reach. As anticipation fades, attention settles more fully into the present. Thoughts are less likely to jump ahead. There is no need to simulate conversations, plan responses, or imagine reactions. The brain recognizes that nothing is being asked of it beyond maintaining balance. This recognition allows internal activity to slow without resistance. Neuroscientific research suggests that anticipation and arousal are closely linked. When the brain expects change, arousal rises to support readiness. When change is unlikely, arousal decreases. Being alone provides consistent signals that immediate change is not expected. Over time, this lowers baseline activation across systems. This reduction in anticipation affects emotional tone as well. Emotions are often intensified by imagined outcomes. Worry, excitement, and concern all depend on future-oriented thinking. When anticipation decreases, emotional signals lose momentum. They are no longer fed by imagined consequences. The system can return towards steadier ground. Importantly, releasing anticipation does not mean becoming unaware. The brain remains capable of responding if something does occur. What changes is priority. The brain no longer treats every moment as a lead-in to the next. It allows the present to stand on its own. This shift often feels relieving because it removes pressure rather than adding emptiness. There is no longer a sense that something is about to happen that must be handled correctly. Experience becomes less conditional. Nothing needs to go well or poorly. It simply continues. As time alone extends, the brain grows more confident that anticipation is unnecessary. Each quiet moment confirms that preparation is not required. Gradually, forward-oriented loops lose relevance. Internal activity becomes more rhythmic and less directional. At night, this effect aligns naturally with rest. Sleep requires the release of future focus. The brain cannot anticipate while sleeping. Being alone helps create the conditions for that release by removing the cues that keep anticipation active. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle settling of momentum. Thoughts stop leaning ahead. Awareness rests more fully where it is. There is less internal motion pulling experience forward. Understanding this effect helps explain why being alone can feel calming even when the mind remains active. Calm does not come from inactivity. It comes from the absence of expectation. When the brain no longer needs to anticipate, it can move toward rest naturally. As anticipation continues to soften, the system becomes increasingly compatible with sleep. There is less to prepare for and less to imagine. The present moment stretches quietly, unburdened by what comes next, allowing the night to unfold without demand, direction, or outcome. As time alone continues, another quiet shift begins to take place. The brain gradually loosens its habit of judging each moment as it arrives. In social and goal-driven environments, experience is often evaluated automatically. Is this good or bad? Is this useful or wasted? Should this feel different? These judgments are not deliberate, but they are constant. When a person is alone, many of the reasons for judging the moment begin to fade. Judgment is closely tied to context. When other people are present, moments carry social meaning. Actions may be evaluated based on how they appear. Time may be assessed based on productivity or engagement. Even rest can be measured against expectation. The brain learns to evaluate experience quickly so it can adjust behavior. This habit becomes background noise over time. When a person is alone, much of this evaluative pressure disappears. There is no shared standard to meet and no external reference point to compare against. The brain no longer needs to determine whether a moment is being used correctly. Experience can unfold without being measured or corrected. As judgment relaxes, attention changes its relationship to sensation and thought. Feelings no longer need to be labeled as appropriate or inappropriate. Thoughts do not need to be assessed for usefulness. The brain is not required to decide whether something should be happening. This reduces internal friction in a way that feels subtle but significant. Neuroscience suggests that judgment activates additional networks related to evaluation and decision-making. These networks require energy and maintain a state of readiness. When judgment is no longer necessary, those networks quiet. Activity shifts toward maintenance and regulation rather than assessment. The system becomes more economical. This shift does not remove awareness or clarity. The brain still notices what is happening. What changes is tone. Experience is allowed to exist without commentary. Sensations pass without being graded. Thoughts arise without being questioned. The present moment is no longer treated as something that must meet criteria. For many people, this is why being alone feels mentally relieving, even when nothing changes externally. The relief does not come from stimulation or distraction. It comes from the absence of internal commentary. When judgment quiets, experience feels lighter, even if it remains the same. Over time, the absence of judgment allows moments to flow into one another more smoothly. The brain is no longer interrupting experience to evaluate it. This continuity supports a sense of ease. There is less stopping and starting, less mental resistance. This effect deepens at night, when the brain naturally begins to disengage from evaluative processes. Being alone accelerates this disengagement by removing cues that trigger comparison or assessment. The system recognizes that nothing needs to be improved or corrected right now. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like acceptance without effort. There is no need to approve of the moment or push it away. Awareness rests where it is, without tension. Experience does not need to justify itself. Understanding this shift helps explain why being alone can feel comforting, rather than empty. The brain is not withdrawing from experience. It is stepping back from judgment. In that space, experience becomes gentler and less demanding. As judgment continues to soften, the system becomes increasingly aligned with rest. There is less internal pushback and less evaluation to resolve. Moments are allowed to arrive and depart quietly, without commentary. In that quiet allowance, the night moves forward at its own pace, and rest finds room to deepen naturally, without expectation or demand. There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives when nothing around you is asking to be understood. A sound can pass without being identified. A sensation can appear without needing a name. The room exists without commentary. In these moments, the senses are finally allowed to do what they do best, receive without translation. In social and busy environments, sensory experience rarely stands alone. Sounds imply meaning. Movements suggest intention. Even subtle changes in the environment can feel like signals that require interpretation. The brain constantly links sensation to context, so it can decide how to respond. This process happens automatically, but it adds layers to perception that make experience feel dense. When a person is alone, many of these layers fall away. A sound no longer needs to be traced back to a source that matters. A shift in temperature does not need to be assessed. The brain no longer asks what a sensation means or whether it requires action. Sensory input is allowed to remain simple. This simplicity does not dull experience. It softens it. Without interpretation pulling sensation forward, perception becomes smoother and less fragmented. The brain does not need to connect one sensation to another or place it within a narrative. Each input can arrive, linger briefly, and then pass without leaving residue. Neuroscience shows that sensory processing becomes more demanding when it is paired with evaluation. The moment the brain decides whether something is relevant, pleasant, or concerning, additional systems activate. When evaluation is unnecessary, those systems quiet. Sensory networks can operate with less interference, conserving energy and reducing internal noise. For many people, this is why being alone feels physically calming even when the environment has not changed. The same sounds exist, the same sensations remain. What has changed is how much work the brain assigns to them. Without social context, perception is no longer tasked with interpretation. This shift also affects how long sensations remain active. Without meaning attached, sensations do not linger. They do not spark chains of thought or emotion. They complete their cycle naturally. The brain does not hold on to them because there is no reason to. Experience stays light. As sensory experience simplifies, attention follows. The brain no longer needs to focus tightly on specific inputs. Awareness becomes broader and more receptive. Sensation does not compete for priority. Everything exists on a similar level, allowing the system to remain steady rather than alert. At night, this effect becomes especially supportive. The environment already offers fewer sensory demands. Being alone removes the final layer of interpretation. The brain recognizes that nothing requires decoding. Perception can soften into the background. supporting the transition toward rest. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like sensory peace rather than silence. Awareness remains open, but it is no longer crowded. Sounds do not intrude. Sensations do not pull. The system is present without being engaged. Understanding this process reframes sensory quiet as a biological response rather than a mental technique. Nothing is being forced. The brain simply recognizes that interpretation is unnecessary and adjusts accordingly. As the senses continue to rest from explanation, experience becomes less detailed and more continuous. Boundaries soften. Inputs blur gently together. The distinction between sensation and stillness becomes less pronounced. In this state, the world does not disappear. It becomes less insistent. Sensation no longer asks to be understood or acted upon. It simply exists and then fades. The brain follows this simplicity naturally, allowing awareness to drift without effort, carried forward by rhythm rather than detail, as the night continues to unfold quietly on its own. There is a moment, often subtle, when the environment feels as though it has stepped back just enough to give you space. Nothing is wrong, nothing is happening, and for once, nothing is asking for a reaction. In that pause, the brain begins to notice that it can stop answering questions that were never spoken out loud. Much of daily life trains the brain to respond. Sounds prompt attention. Messages invite reply. Even quiet moments can feel provisional, as if something is about to happen. The brain stays slightly alert, prepared to react at any time. This readiness is not anxiety, it is adaptation. But it keeps the system oriented outward, waiting. When a person is alone, many of these silent prompts disappear. The environment becomes less conversational. Objects do not expect interaction. Sounds do not imply intent. The brain recognizes that it does not need to respond in order to remain safe or functional. This recognition allows a deep layer of readiness to loosen. As the need to react fades, internal activity begins to reorganize. The brain no longer needs to monitor for shifts or changes that require immediate adjustment. Attention becomes less jumpy. There is no reason to pivot quickly from one stimulus to the next. Experience unfolds at a slower, steadier pace. This reduction in reactivity has a calming effect across systems. Emotional responses soften because they are no longer being triggered by anticipation. Physical tension decreases because the body does not need to prepare for movement or expression. The nervous system moves away from alertness and toward equilibrium. Neuroscience suggests that reactivity is closely tied to prediction. The brain reacts when it expects change. When change becomes unlikely, prediction slows, and reaction loses urgency. Being alone provides consistent evidence that nothing sudden is required. Over time, this evidence reshapes how the brain allocates energy. This shift does not eliminate awareness. The brain still notices what is present. What changes is emphasis. Experience no longer needs to be met with commentary or adjustment. A sound can occur without prompting attention. A thought can arise without leading to action. The system is allowed to remain still. For many people, this is why being alone can feel unexpectedly relieving. The relief does not come from isolation. It comes from the absence of demand. The world is no longer asking anything of you, and the brain is no longer preparing to answer. As this state continues, internal rhythms begin to align. The brain settles into patterns that are less reactive and more cyclical. Activity becomes smoother. Transitions feel gentler. There is less startle and less interruption. The system no longer needs to keep itself on standby. At night, this effect deepens naturally. The environment already offers fewer prompts. Being alone removes the final layer of expectation. The brain recognizes that nothing will interrupt the moment. It allows itself to remain where it is, without scanning ahead. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a quiet sense of permission. There is no need to stay alert, no need to be ready. Awareness rests without leaning forward or pulling back. Experience is allowed to arrive and pass without reaction. Understanding this response reframes calm as a biological state, rather than a mental achievement. Calm does not require effort. It emerges when reactivity is no longer necessary. Being alone provides the conditions for that emergence by removing the cues that keep reaction alive. As the world continues to ask less of you, the brain follows suit. Reaction slows. Readiness dissolves. What remains is a steady, unhurried awareness that does not need to do anything at all. In this state, the night feels less like something to move through and more like something to rest within. The brain no longer waits for the next signal. It allows experience to continue quietly, without interruption or demand, making space for rest to deepen naturally as everything settles into stillness on its own. There is a certain kind of comfort that does not come from words, touch, or reassurance. It comes from absence, from the simple fact that nothing is pressing in. When you're alone long enough, the quiet around you can begin to feel less like emptiness and more like support, as if the space itself is doing some of the work for you. In daily life, comfort is often associated with something active: a conversation, a distraction, a familiar voice. But the nervous system recognizes another form of comfort, one that comes from stability rather than stimulation. When the environment remains unchanged and undemanding, the brain begins to interpret that consistency as safety. Nothing new is happening, and nothing needs to happen. This interpretation has a calming effect across the system. The brain no longer needs to stay alert for shifts or signals. The body no longer needs to brace for interruption. Over time, this steadiness creates a sense of being contained rather than exposed. The quiet stops feeling wide and open. It feels close, predictable, and gentle. Neuroscience shows that the brain is highly sensitive to patterns. Environments that remain consistent allow internal rhythms to synchronize more easily. When a person is alone in a stable space, external variation decreases. Lighting stays the same. Sounds are familiar. Movement is minimal. These conditions allow the brain to reduce monitoring and increase coordination. As this coordination deepens, internal sensations become easier to tolerate. There is less reactivity to small discomforts. The system does not amplify signals because nothing is competing for attention. Sensations are allowed to exist without escalation. This contributes to the feeling that the quiet is holding you, rather than leaving you unguarded. This effect also influences emotional tone. Without external input shaping mood, emotions tend to drift toward neutral. They are no longer being reinforced by feedback or reaction. The brain does not need to adjust feelings to fit a situation. Emotional states soften and stabilize on their own. Importantly, this sense of being held by quiet does not depend on isolation as an idea. It depends on conditions: predictability, low demand, familiarity. Being alone simply makes these conditions easier to maintain. The comfort comes from the environment staying the same long enough for the nervous system to trust it. For many people, this is why quiet time alone can feel deeply reassuring after periods of stimulation or stress. The system has been adapting continuously. Alone, it finally encounters a stretch of time where adaptation is no longer required. That pause allows internal resources to recover. As the sense of safety grows, the body responds. Muscles release further. Breathing becomes slower and more regular. The brain shifts toward patterns associated with rest and recovery. None of this is forced. It emerges from the absence of disturbance. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle enclosure, not confinement, but containment. Awareness does not feel scattered. It rests comfortably within the boundaries of the moment. There is no need to reach outward or pull inward. Everything that is needed is already present. Understanding this response helps reframe quiet as a form of support, rather than a lack of connection. The brain does not always need engagement to feel safe. Sometimes it needs sameness. Being alone provides a stable field where sameness can persist without interruption. As this feeling continues, the night begins to feel less exposed and more sheltered. The quiet becomes familiar. The space feels trustworthy. The brain no longer scans for what might happen. It allows itself to settle into what is already here. In this state, rest does not need to be pursued. It arrives naturally, carried by the steady presence of quiet. Being alone becomes less about absence and more about containment, allowing the system to soften further, supported by nothing more than the fact that nothing is asking for anything at all. There are moments in quiet aloneness when the sense of self begins to feel softer around the edges. Not absent, not lost, but less sharply outlined. The roles you move through during the day, the identities you carry for others, and the expectations attached to them begin to loosen their hold. In this space, the self does not need to be maintained or reinforced. It can simply rest. In social life, identity is constantly being updated. The brain keeps track of who it is in relation to others. It adjusts tone, behavior, and emphasis based on context. Even when these adjustments are subtle, they require continuous reference to an internal model of the self. This model helps interaction flow smoothly, but it also keeps the sense of self active and defined. When a person is alone, much of this referencing becomes unnecessary. There is no external feedback asking the brain to confirm or clarify identity. The system no longer needs to check whether it is being consistent, appropriate, or understood. As a result, the boundaries of the self begin to relax. This relaxation does not lead to confusion. Instead, it creates a sense of spaciousness. Thoughts and feelings no longer need to be traced back to a specific identity. They can exist without being labeled as belonging to a particular version of the self. The brain does not need to decide what something says about who you are. Neuroscience suggests that the sense of self is not a fixed structure, but an ongoing process maintained by attention and memory. When attention is no longer directed toward maintaining that process, the sense of self naturally softens. Being alone provides the conditions for this softening by reducing the need for self-referencing. As the self becomes less defined, mental activity often feels lighter. There is less internal commentary about what is happening and why. Experience becomes less personal in the evaluative sense. Sensations and thoughts arise without being immediately connected to identity or story. This state can feel calming because it removes a layer of effort that often goes unnoticed. Maintaining a sense of self requires continuity and comparison. When those processes pause, the system conserves energy. The brain is free to focus on balance rather than representation. At night, this effect is especially supportive of rest. Sleep does not require a strong sense of self. In fact, self-awareness naturally fades as sleep approaches. Being alone helps ease this transition by allowing identity-related processes to quiet earlier and more gently. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle unburdening. There is no need to be anyone in particular. Awareness does not need to hold on to a definition. It can remain open and unstructured, allowing experience to flow without attachment. Understanding this shift helps reframe being alone as a space where the self is allowed to loosen, not disappear. The brain is not losing itself. It is resting from the work of defining itself. As the sense of self continues to soften, the system moves closer to the conditions needed for sleep. There is less to hold together and less to protect. Experience becomes simpler, quieter, and less bound to identity. In this softened state, the night no longer asks who you are or what you should be. It simply holds space for awareness to drift without definition, allowing rest to arrive naturally as the boundaries of the self fade gently into the background. There is a subtle shift that can occur after enough time has passed in quiet aloneness, when experience begins to feel less unfinished. Moments no longer seem to be waiting for something to happen next. Thoughts do not linger as if they need resolution. Sensations arrive, exist, and fade without leaving a sense that something was missed. In this state, experience feels whole rather than partial. Much of daily life trains the brain to treat moments as transitional. One thing leads to another. Each experience is framed by what came before it and what must follow. This forward momentum keeps the system oriented toward continuation. Even rest can feel incomplete if it is being used to prepare for the next demand. The brain becomes accustomed to holding experience open-ended. When a person is alone, many of these transitions lose their purpose. There is no interaction to carry forward and no context that requires continuity. The brain no longer needs to leave experiences open in case they must be revisited or responded to. This allows moments to close naturally rather than remaining suspended. Neuroscience suggests that the brain is constantly managing prediction and completion. When an outcome is expected, neural activity remains elevated until that outcome occurs. Being alone reduces the number of expected outcomes. Without anticipation or response required, neural activity is allowed to settle. Experiences reach completion without being extended. This sense of completion does not depend on understanding or reflection. The brain does not need to analyze what has happened in order to let it go. Completion emerges from the absence of interruption. When nothing interrupts a moment, the system can move on without resistance. As this process unfolds, mental activity begins to feel less fragmented. Thoughts are not cut short by distraction or obligation. Sensations are not layered with interpretation. Each experience is given just enough space to exist fully and then dissolve. This reduces the accumulation of unfinished mental threads. For many people, this is why being alone can feel mentally satisfying even when nothing memorable occurs. Satisfaction does not come from novelty. It comes from completion. When moments are allowed to finish, the brain carries less forward. The system becomes lighter without effort. This effect also influences emotional tone. Emotions often persist when they are left unresolved by context or response. Being alone removes many of the conditions that keep emotions active. Feelings are allowed to rise and fall without reinforcement. The brain does not keep them open because nothing requires their continuation. Over time, this creates a sense of internal closure. Not finality, but fullness. Experience does not feel lacking or interrupted. The brain no longer treats the present as a placeholder for something else. It allows moments to be enough on their own. At night, this sense of completion aligns naturally with rest. Sleep depends on the brain's ability to let go of unfinished processes. Being alone supports this by allowing experiences to resolve quietly before sleep arrives. There is less mental residue to carry into the night. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle settling. There is no urgency to continue thinking or doing. Awareness rests comfortably within the present without pulling toward the next moment. The system is not waiting. Understanding this shift helps explain why quiet time alone can feel deeply restful, even without deliberate relaxation. The brain is not being calmed. It is being allowed to complete what it started. In that completion, tension releases naturally. As this state continues, experience becomes less segmented and more continuous. Moments flow into one another without friction. There is less internal resistance and less need to move forward. The night opens into a space where nothing is pending and nothing is required. In this space, rest does not feel like an interruption of activity. It feels like a continuation of completion. Being alone allows experience to finish gently, clearing the way for sleep to arrive without pressure, expectation, or unfinished business, carried forward quietly by the simple fact that nothing is left open. There is a quiet relief that comes from realizing that nothing about this moment needs to be communicated. No thought has to be explained. No feeling has to be named. No experience has to be turned into language or meaning for someone else. When you're alone long enough, this realization settles gently, and the mind begins to rest from the work of sharing. Much of everyday experience is shaped by the possibility of expression. The brain quietly prepares thoughts as if they might be spoken. Feelings are framed in ways that could be described. Even private moments are often rehearsed internally, as though they might later be translated into words. This habit keeps the mind active, leaning toward articulation. When a person is alone, that lean begins to ease. There is no audience waiting, real or imagined. The brain no longer needs to convert experience into something transferable. Sensations do not need to be labeled. Thoughts do not need to be organized into sentences. Experience can remain exactly as it is, unspoken and unstructured. Neuroscience suggests that language-related networks remain subtly active even during silence, especially when the brain anticipates communication. When that anticipation disappears, those networks quiet. This does not reduce intelligence or awareness. It reduces effort. The mind no longer needs to package experience into forms that can be shared. As this shift unfolds, internal activity becomes more fluid. Thoughts may appear as impressions rather than statements. Feelings may be sensed without needing to be defined. The brain is no longer translating constantly between experience and expression. This frees attention to rest within sensation itself. This absence of sharing also softens emotional tone. Emotions often intensify when they are shaped for communication. When they do not need to be conveyed, they can remain gentle and brief. The system does not hold on to them for emphasis. They complete their cycle naturally. Over time, the lack of communicative pressure allows the mind to settle into a quieter rhythm. There is less internal rehearsal and less anticipation of response. Experience does not need to be remembered in words. It can exist and fade without leaving a trace. This effect is especially noticeable at night. The world offers fewer opportunities for interaction, and the brain recognizes that expression is unlikely. Language loosens its grip. Thought becomes less verbal and more sensory. Awareness drifts without narration. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a softening of inner speech. Not silence, but simplicity. There is less commentary and less explanation. Experience feels closer and more immediate, no longer filtered through the need to describe it. Understanding this shift helps explain why being alone can feel mentally relieving even when thoughts are present. The relief does not come from thinking less. It comes from translating less. When experience does not need to be shared, the mind can rest inside it. As this state continues, awareness becomes more settled and less directional. There is no need to prepare anything for later. Nothing is being gathered or stored. The present moment does not need to survive beyond itself. In this space, the night feels more intimate and contained. Experience belongs only to itself. Nothing needs to be carried forward. The mind is free to drift without explanation, allowing rest to deepen naturally, supported by the simple comfort of knowing that nothing about this moment needs to be shared at all. There is a quiet kind of permission that arrives when nothing around you requires effort. Not the permission that comes from reassurance or encouragement, but the kind that comes from absence. Absence of expectation, absence of evaluation, absence of the subtle pressure to be doing something correctly. When you're alone long enough, the brain begins to recognize that trying is no longer necessary. Much of waking life is shaped by effort, even when that effort is gentle. Attention is guided, behavior is adjusted, thoughts are steered toward usefulness or clarity. Even rest can carry an undertone of intention, as though it must be effective or restorative. The brain becomes accustomed to maintaining a low level of striving, simply because the environment continues to suggest that something should be happening. When a person is alone, that suggestion begins to fade. There is no task implied by the moment, no signal that improvement is required. The brain slowly releases its grip on optimization. It no longer needs to make the moment better, clearer, or more meaningful. The moment is allowed to be sufficient exactly as it is. This release does not feel dramatic. It often feels like a soft exhale that happens without awareness. The mind stops leaning forward. There is less internal adjustment. Thoughts are not pushed away, but they are also not shaped or refined. The brain recognizes that effort does not lead anywhere right now, and so it lets effort go. Neuroscience suggests that effort is closely tied to goal orientation. When a goal is present, the brain organizes activity around reaching it. When no goal is implied, that organization becomes unnecessary. Being alone removes many implicit goals. There is nothing to complete, respond to, or improve. The brain adjusts by reducing exertion across systems. This reduction has a calming effect because effort itself consumes energy. When the brain stops trying to manage experience, internal resources are conserved. Activity becomes simpler and more sustainable. The system no longer needs to push or hold itself together. It can remain steady without strain. For many people, this is why being alone can feel relieving even when nothing comforting is added. Relief does not always come from support or reassurance. Sometimes it comes from the end of effort. The realization that nothing is required can be more soothing than any instruction to relax. As effort fades, emotional tone often shifts as well. Feelings lose their edge when they are no longer being managed. There is no need to correct mood or maintain composure. Emotions are allowed to exist briefly and then pass. The brain does not interfere because nothing is at stake. This state also affects the sense of self. Without effort, identity becomes less active. There is no need to uphold a version of yourself. The brain does not need to decide how you should be. Awareness rests without direction, free from the work of being someone. At night, this permission to stop trying aligns naturally with sleep. Sleep cannot occur while effort remains active. The brain must first let go of striving. Being alone helps create the conditions for that release by removing the cues that keep effort alive. From the perspective of the mind, this can feel like a gentle surrender, not to tiredness, but to ease. There is nothing to fix, nothing to improve. Experience does not need to be shaped or guided. It can simply continue. Understanding this shift helps explain why being alone can feel deeply restful without deliberate relaxation. The brain is not being told to calm down. It is being allowed to stop trying. In that allowance, effort dissolves naturally. As this permission settles in, the night feels less demanding and more spacious. There is no need to arrive anywhere. Nothing needs to change. The brain follows the absence of effort toward a quieter state, where rest is not pursued, but permitted. In this space, being alone becomes a gentle signal that you can stop holding yourself up. The moment does not ask for anything. And because nothing is asked, the system finally has room to let go, allowing sleep to approach softly, carried by the simple relief of no longer needing to try at all. As this quiet time together begins to draw to a close, there is nothing you need to take with you from it. No idea needs to be remembered. No conclusion needs to be formed. Everything that has unfolded tonight has already done its work simply by passing through at its own pace. Being alone, as we've explored, is not something that needs to be solved or explained. It is a condition the body and the mind understand deeply. When the world grows quiet and nothing asks for attention, the system naturally begins to settle. Effort fades. Readiness dissolves. What remains is a steady, gentle awareness that does not need direction. At this point in the night, you may notice that thoughts feel farther apart, or that the sense of time has softened. You may feel less defined, less pulled forward, less required to be anything at all. If that's happening, there is nothing to do with it. The quiet knows how to hold itself. You do not need to guide it. Rest does not arrive because it is summoned. It arrives when nothing stands in its way. When there is no expectation to meet, no reaction to prepare for, and no effort left to maintain, the body and the brain naturally move towards sleep. This movement is gentle. It does not announce itself. It simply continues. If you are still awake, that is perfectly fine. There is no schedule to follow here. And if sleep has already begun to take hold, then this moment can fade without being noticed at all. Either way, nothing is being missed. The quiet around you does not need to be filled. It does not need meaning. It does not need company. It is enough on its own, steady and unchanged, allowing everything else to slow and soften within it. Thank you for spending this time here. Wherever you are listening from tonight, you are welcome to rest exactly as you are. The night will carry things forward from here, gently and without urgency, as you continue on towards sleep, supported by nothing more than the simple relief of nothing being asked of you anymore. Good night.